1962, Wilfred Winkenbach from the Oakland Raiders organization drew up the first basic rules for fantasy football. During the 90s, the internet boom helped make the game of fantasy sports more popular. In 2006, the Unlawful Internet Gambling Act was put into place, citing that fantasy sports was legal because it was a game of skill, not a game of chance. In 2009, one of the first daily fantasy sports sites was opened called FanDuel. Later in 2011, the second biggest site was opened called DraftKings. These 5 points helped shape the fantasy sports industry into what it is today. In my video, I will tell you the basic overview of the new version of fantasy sports called daily fantasy sports. Daily fantasy sports is a very new industry and is not very well regulated. To get a sense of how big the daily fantasy sports industry is, there's overall 58 million players, and this year there were $2.6 billion in entry fees and is forecasted to grow at 41% through 2020. The graph below shows the forecasted growth for the industry and was done by the CEO of the second biggest daily fantasy site, DraftKings. FanDuel and DraftKings are both backed by multi-billion-dollar companies which include Fox Sports, Time Warner, NBC, and Comcast. Both these companies are less than 7 years old and have valuations at about $1.3 billion and $1.2 billion. The Unlawful Internet Gambling Act is what made daily fantasy sports possible. In the law, it says fantasy sports is a game of skill rather than a game of chance like traditional sports betting. One of the biggest research firms in the world, McKinsey & Company, examined the first half of the 2015 baseball season and found 91% of the winnings were won by 1.3% of the players. That data can be taken in two ways. One way that can be taken is that only 1.3% of the people won almost all the money. But the other way it can be looked at is that it is a game of skill rather than gambling, because that 1.3% put in more time researching than most people probably did, and that backs up the Unlawful Internet Gambling Act that states that fantasy sports is a game of skill rather than a game of chance, like traditional sports betting. One reason people enjoy daily fantasy over traditional fantasy sports is the time you have to wait to win. In traditional fantasy sports, that can be over 4 months just to win one time. In daily fantasy, you can play every day and can possibly even win every day. Building off that idea, it's much cheaper to play daily fantasy rather than traditional fantasy leagues. In most cases, daily fantasy is cheaper because you can enter a league for just $1. Buy-ins for traditional fantasy leagues range from just $10 but can reach as high as a couple $1,000s. So you can also enter more leagues for the same amount of money. A couple more reasons people enjoy daily fantasy sports over traditional fantasy sports is the flexibility with injury. If your best player gets injured in a traditional season-long league, that can be devastating for your team and can be a problem for the whole season. In daily fantasy, that injury may only last a day or a week at most. One more reason people enjoy daily fantasy over traditional fantasy is how easy it is. Daily fantasy is very simple to play. You have a salary cap and you have to fill a certain number of positions staying under that salary cap. The apps and websites are very easy to use and have stats and news right on the app, so you don't have to go to other sites. And focus on the positive aspects of daily fantasy sports. But there's problems also. For example, there was a scandal where employees from FanDuel and DraftKings, the two biggest sites, stole vital data that helped them win thousands of dollars. Also, because it's such a new industry, there's not much regulation. But with more regulation, the government can make huge sums of revenue by taxing players' winnings. For example, the UK generates about $9.6 billion each year in revenue from regulated gambling. Some states are against daily fantasy sports, though, which is why FanDuel and DraftKings between them have about 75 lobbyists fighting for about 30 states. As of August 24th, daily fantasy sports was only legal in 12 states, with legislation being proposed in another 13 states. In the end, the states have to say if daily fantasy sports meets their regulations for legal or illegal gambling.